Good morning. There are 613 mitzvot in the Torah, but of those we can observe now 369 because many of them have just followed have become obsolete after the destruction of the temple. Those mitzvot related to the workings of the temple, the workings of the Kohanim, the sacrifices, and other situations that do not exist anymore. But of those mitzvot have sprouted many more mitzvot. And that contradicts a sentence or a verse in today's parasha, actually it's chapter 13, verse 1, that says, "These are the words," or "this is the Torah, this is the law I give you, and you should observe it. Do not add to it, do not subtract, do not take away from it." And of course the rabbis ask, why? Why can't we add to it? Wouldn't it be nice, for instance, to take the lulav, which has 4 species for Sukkot, and add one more thing to make it nicer? Maybe a flower will be nicer, will be enhancing the mitzvah. And the answer is no, you cannot do that, because if you do that, you would be observing, eventually you may be observing that mitzvah because it's something that you like, you enjoy doing it, and not because it's a command. That's what mitzvah means, command. And also because if you feel free to add something to the mitzvah, you also may feel free to subtract something from the mitzvah, and that will be a violation of the mitzvah. And there is a nice midrash that explains that. And the midrash relates to Adam, Eve, and the snake. The Torah says, all the way in Bereshit, that God told Adam in the Garden of Eden, "You can eat from every tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if you eat from that tree, you will die." Now somehow Adam told Eve, or Eve heard about it, and the snake did too, because a few verses later, the snake asked Eve, "Did God say that you cannot eat from any tree here in the garden?" And Eve said, "No." Well, she didn't say no. She said, "God said we can eat from every tree except this one, or touch it, because if we do, we'll die." And the snake said, "No, you will not die." And that's what the midrash says. He gave a little push to Eve against the tree. She touched the tree, and nothing happened. She didn't die. So she saw that nothing happened, so she took the fruit, ate it, and the rest is history. That's why we are here today. But still, the rabbis did add and did make changes to the mitzvot. And how do they explain that? They justify it based on another verse in chapter 17, which we'll read next week, that says, if a case is too complicated for you, you don't understand what the ruling is or the law is, you should consult the priest or the judge that are in charge at the time. And that means that every time, in every generation, there is going to be maybe a different interpretation or a different understanding of the law, and you have to obey their rulings. So based on that, the rabbis made changes. Now, what they made sure, they explained, they insisted that those new rules, the people have to understand clearly that these rules were made by the rabbis. They are not from the Torah. So there are 2 kinds of rules. One's called the Oraita, means mitzvot that are written in the Torah, and those really didn't change. And then there are mitzvot de Rabanan, meaning from the rabbis. Now, what type of changes did the rabbis make? There are different kinds based on for different reasons. For instance, they had a few completely new mitzvot. For instance, lighting Shabbat candles. The Torah doesn't say anywhere that we have to light Shabbat candles. That came from the rabbis. And they based it first on the command not to light a fire on Shabbat, but on Shabbat you need light. So people lit the fires on Friday before Shabbat started, and then eventually that evolved into lighting candles on Friday to be used for Shabbat, and then about the 9th century it became a mitzvah with the bracha associated to it. So that's brand new. And then there is examples of laws that were changed to accommodate the current, let's say, philosophy of the times. For instance, the death penalty. The Torah contemplates the death penalty for certain crimes. Murder, for instance, carries with it the penalty of death. But the rabbis didn't like the death penalty, and they made everything possible to eliminate it or to make it so difficult. For instance, the Torah says that a murderer or a person can be condemned to death only if there are two witnesses. And the Talmud added, well, the two witnesses cannot be related to each other, they cannot be related to the victim, they cannot be related to the perpetrator, and there are other conditions that they made it so difficult that the death penalty was rarely carried out. As a matter of fact, Israel doesn't have the death penalty, and the only person ever executed was Eichmann, which he deserved it. There are other type of rules that are explaining or expanding on some mitzvah that the Torah just gave very shortly. For instance, Shabbat. The Torah says you shall not work on Shabbat. But then what does work mean? What is work? So the rabbis had to look at it, and they thought that a good explanation would be work is every activity related to the building of the tabernacle, and that's what work. Now, those, for instance, cutting wood or drawing or writing, those are not explicit in the Torah, but the rabbis added to the definition of work. And then there is another type of rule, which is the fence around the mitzvah. These are rules that are put in there to make sure that the people are not going to violate a ruling. For instance, there is something called muktzah, which means you do not move or you don't touch something that you're not going to need. An example is, for instance, it's not allowed to hold the pencil in your hand on Shabbat. Now, the Torah doesn't say anything about that, but you're not supposed to write. If you have a pencil in your hand, maybe just inadvertently you can doodle or write or make a drawing, violating the rules. So that's a fence around the Torah, protecting the actual ruling. And these are some of the examples of how the rabbis managed to go around this prohibition of adding or subtracting from the Torah. Shabbat Shalom.